seat. Your Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, distinguished guests, hello, welcome. My name is Dan Murphy. Thank you so much for joining us today. I'm very pleased to be joined on stage by Her Excellency Hessa Buhumaid, the UAE Minister of Community Development. Also joining us today is Pedro Conceicao, the Director of Human Development Report Office at the UN Development Programme. And we're also joined today by Dr. Caren, the Senior Director for Gender at the World Bank Group. So please do make them feel welcome. I'd like to begin our session by asking Her Excellency to just make some opening remarks about the significance of today. Your Excellency, good morning.
Sure, thank you very much, Dan. Good morning, everyone. Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Ladies and gentlemen, distinguished guests, good morning again. It's a pleasure to be among you today, and especially to discuss the global gender balance at the Global Women Forum. In Dubai, we're meeting again, and it's 2020 already. Under the patronage of His Highness Sheikh Mohammed bin Rashid Al Maktoum, Vice President, UAE Prime Minister, and the ruler of Dubai. In the UAE, we believe that women and men are equal partners in society. This fundamental belief supported our ranking as the leading country in gender equality in the region, according to the World Economic Forum's Global Gender Gap Report in 2018. The UAE was one of the region's best performing countries, having closed 64% of the gap, of the overall gap. The UAE also saw a reduction of the gap with regards to legislations, senior officials, managers, and healthy lifetime expectancy. Gender balance is of an important matter in the United Arab Emirates. The Constitution of the UAE guarantees equal rights of both men and women. And I think that's a very important topic that we need to discuss today. We're talking about gender balance. We're talking about both genders, men and women. Women have been working alongside men to continue the path of development and progress as planned by the late Sheikh Zayed bin Sultan Al Nahyan, may his soul rest in peace. Along with the late Sheikh Zayed, the mother of the nation, Her Highness Sheikha Fatima bint Mubarak, started and is continuing this movement, the women empowerment movement in the United Arab Emirates. She's the chairwoman of the General Women Union, president of the Supreme Council of the Motherhood and Childhood, and the Supreme Chairwoman of the Family Development Foundation. She also instrumented a full movement 40 years ago. And as a result of that, you see us sitting here today in front of you. You see United Arab Emirates women participating not only in regional, but in international platforms. As institutions concerned with the empowerment of women in the UAE, we have played a vital role in the progress of many efforts, such as the Gender Balance Council, led by Her Highness Sheikha Manal bint Mohammed bin Rashid Al Maktoum and her team, who oversees the implementation of best practices, review legislations and policies, and make recommendations for reducing gender disparity and achieving balance in the public and private sectors, especially in decision-making fields. We were just having a quick discussion this morning, talking about this amazing council. What this council is doing in the United Arab Emirates, unfortunately, this council is actually increasing the awareness of the importance of gender balance. This council is not fighting for any rights, because we believe in the United Arab Emirates that everyone should be granted their power and should not be fighting for that. As for the Ministry of Community Development, we present effective social benefits policies that benefit a large number of social groups, including subcategories of women in need of support. Also, we have a program that supports productive families, entrepreneurial families, since the launch in 2018. Around 4,000 entrepreneurial Emirati productive families have been registered and are now active members of a Sana'a project. These projects and these programs have not only helped them financially within the United Arab Emirates, they have also been able to explore opportunities around the world. They were able to go and present their micro businesses in amazing universal platforms. 40% of these entrepreneurial families are from the youth category. 95% of the registered families, programs, and projects are led by women. We all know gender balance is essentially linked to sustainable development. The overall objective of gender equality is a society in which women and men enjoy the same opportunities, rights, and obligations in all spheres of life. Regardless of where you live, advancing gender equality is critical to all areas of healthy society, from reducing poverty to promoting healthy, very well education systems, protection to all well-beings for both boys and girls. Let us be clear. Gender balance is not only a fundamental human right, but a necessary foundation for a peaceful, prosperous, and sustainable world. Unfortunately, at the current time, 1 to 5 women and girls between the age of 15 and 49 have reported experiencing physical violence within a 12-month period, and 49 countries currently have no law protecting women from domestic violence. Gender equality helps prevent violence against women and rights and make our communities safer and healthier. It's a human right, and it's a right that is good for the economy. For example, in Australia, studies have showed that businesses with at least 30% women in leadership positions are 15% more profitable. What does this mean? EU. Economic and Financial Affairs mentioned in their reports on the economic benefits of the gender equality, a more gender-equal EU would have strong, positive GDP impact growing over time, higher level of employment and productivity, and could respond to challenges related to the aging population in the EU. The empowerment of women and girls has been reflected from the UAE to the world. It has crossed the borders of the UAE globally. For example, the UAE's aid to foreign countries was launched in 2017 with a basic focus on women who present the strong basis for a sustainable development. Recently, the UAE launched the concept of 100% women policy, which aims to ensure that 100% of these bilateral and multilateral foreign aids target gender equality and at the same time achieve the goal of influential and real empowerment of women and girls by 2021. In light of towards bridging gap and accomplishment of gender balance, we work together to empower a promising community and achieve the aspirations of our UAE wise leadership towards our Centennial 2071 and the ambitious development strategies and goals. Thank you.
Your Excellency, thank you so much for those remarks. And it is important that we meet here in the region today because, of course, the UAE has seen compelling progress, but gaps remain in this part of the world. When you look at the data, 6 out of the 10 countries in the region, 6 of 10 countries in the region have the highest gender gap in the world. So this is quite important to have this conversation in this part of the world in particular. Dr. Caren, I wanted to go over to you next. Why do you think the barriers are still so high for women in this part of the world?
Thank you so much, and thank you so much. It was fantastic to hear what you said. I should state first and foremost that there are barriers to women's participation and equality in all parts of the world. So we shouldn't forget that. There's no country, even our favorite countries that we love to cite, are perfect, and we all have a ways to go. I think that the barriers are for a number of reasons. Of course, we know that there are laws that still discriminate against married women compared to married men. One of the things to celebrate is that in this region, we have a women business and the law database. The top performers in terms of changing, reforming, getting rid of discriminatory laws has been in the MENA region. It's really fantastic. But still, there are women still around the world have only 3/4 of the legal rights as men have. So that's one barrier. There are other barriers having to do with just the fact that we don't have the support systems, for instance, for care of children, care of the elderly, care of dependents. And when you look around the world for countries that are interested in increasing their female labor force participation rate, lack of care is a huge constraint. The fact that many transportation systems are unsafe, women around the world report sexual harassment and fear of taking public transport, and many more women rely on public transport than men. So that's a barrier. There's also barriers. We think that technology, for instance, is an incredible enabler, and it is. But far fewer women than men actually own the phone or have access to the internet. And some of this has to do with the way income is distributed, the way wealth is distributed. Women don't earn as much. Women don't have the assets that men do: land, housing, access to finance, and now the technology. And finally, I think there's social norms, which we have to pay much more attention to. But we're learning a lot about how to change social norms at the same time as we create the systems that would enable women to participate on a level playing field as men.
Pedro, what does the latest Human Development Report tell us about the extent of these gaps today?
Let me pick up on the issue of social norms that Caren just mentioned, because this is something that the Human Development Report actually tries to measure. So what are social norms? Social norms are habits, cultures, expectations that drive our behavior. So a lot of our behavior is regulated by formal institutions, by laws, by legal obligations and responsibilities. But a lot of what we do in our daily life is driven by social norms, what's seen as acceptable. It's very difficult to measure, as you would imagine, but in the report what we tried to do was to look at opinion poll surveys and try to code answers to questions such as, do you think that men make for better political leaders than women? Or do you think that men make for better executives than women? Now, this is not the government, this is the people, the population. So if the answer to this question is yes, we code this as reflecting a bias in social norms against gender equality. And what we found was that if we look at the results from these surveys from the period 2005 to 2009, women actually, and I'm just referring to responses from women, 56% of women reflected a bias in one of 10 questions of this type against gender equality, 56% of women. Now, if we look at more recent data, from 2010 to 2014, and this was really shocking to us, we actually saw an increase in social norms that reflect biases against gender equality, which was quite puzzling, and also that some of the pushback against gender equality was actually happening in some of the countries in which achievements have been highest, substantive achievements in gender equality. So our interpretation of these results is that, as you know, the work towards gender equality is a never-ending struggle. It always needs to be energized, and that's why it's so important to be in this forum here today. And it's a job that is never done. And especially as women get to more powerful positions, we see that this pushback becomes more intense reflected in gender norms. Once again, this is not about government. Let me conclude with a thought on technology that Caren also mentioned. And this also reflects why the agenda toward gender equality is a never-ending process. So we have evidence today that new technologies associated with artificial intelligence, automation, actually are more likely to put some jobs currently performed by women at risk than men, because women are overrepresented in jobs and tasks that are classified as being routine. So they are more at risk. So this is one important factor to bear in mind. And then secondly, we know that artificial intelligence algorithms are trained given the information that's fed to them. And so many of the artificial intelligence algorithms that are now used reflect the world that we live in. And we have evidence, for instance, that some of the artificial intelligence algorithms that are related to helping people to find jobs actually do not target women when it comes to high-paying jobs, because they are trained to reflect the world in which we live in today. And we know that today, women performing the same job with the same level of education on average globally earn 75% what equivalent male earns. So if we are not careful, if we don't increase the representation of women in STEM particularly, we confront the challenge of actually having gender equality or gender inequality being exacerbated.
I also wanted to talk about some of the government responses that we've seen to addressing these challenges, not just here in the UAE, but around the world. This time last year, we saw the Trump administration in the United States introduce the fantastic WGDP initiative, and this has been spearheaded by our guest, Ivanka Trump. Ivanka and her team have been looking at this, and they say that when women are economically empowered, they reinvest in their families and in their communities, which is, of course, important for us here in the UAE as well. And that investment produces a multiplier effect that spurs economic growth and contributes to global peace and stability. So, Your Excellency, how important is government support when it comes to addressing these issues, particularly in areas like female empowerment in the economy and economic empowerment?
Well, empowerment of women starts at a very, very early age. Start at the early age of having equal access to education, just boys and girls, and at the right time. We were, and we will always continue to be very lucky in the United Arab Emirates in having such a supportive leadership that believes in those equal rights. So girls have equal access to full education right at the very beginning, and then this support continues when it comes to receiving higher education. 77% of Emirati women enroll in education after secondary school. 70% of university graduates in the United Arab Emirates are women. 56% of government university graduates are in science, technology, and engineering, which is STEM. So the literacy rate of women in the United Arab Emirates is 95.8%, 96%. Having an educated woman means that you are having an educated society. This woman will end up being a mother, a sister, a daughter, a wife. The power of empowering women is unbelievable. Not only there, the government have also believed in empowering women with work-life balance regulations. And this is what women want around the world and need. If you ask for women to go higher and higher positions in the workforce, she will definitely end up requiring some sort of adjustments. And when we talk about those adjustments, especially reviewing the laws, regulations, we're talking about a sustainable family. We believe in having sustainable families that will support the full ecosystem. 30% of public sector positions in the United Arab Emirates are held by women. 15% of them are in technical and academic roles. Myself, I feel I'm so lucky to have such a supporting ecosystem that enabled us to arrive where we are here today. This year, we celebrate that 50% of our national council, our parliament basically, is represented by women. I attended a session with them less than a month ago, and I was so proud and happy to look up and see this amazing representation of women that has the voice and the power to raise their voice higher and higher. We know that the future is brighter when women is given a chance to speak up, because a woman speaks up for not only for herself, not only for her colleagues, but she speaks up for the whole society.
Caren, I wanted to ask you about the gaps that we see closing, not just in education and in areas like healthcare as well, but some of the issues that still remain when it comes to female participation in the labour force, particularly in the MENA region, where we see these markets being characterised by low female participation, in some cases discrimination against women as well. Can you tell us a bit about the statistics that we're seeing today, and are you able to quantify the economic and social impact that we see when women are empowered in the workplace?
So I think that there are still a number of gaps, and I think that there are really good approaches, and hopefully we can come to them to actually address the gaps and close them quickly, because we know that we can't really wait for 150 years or even 75 years. Here in the MENA region as a whole, as you have all noted, labor force participation is low. It's about 21% in 2018 compared to men, which is about 74%. Unfortunately, the MENA region still has one of the highest wage gaps. It's about 40%. I think importantly, when we look at entrepreneurship, and which is really critical to the growth and the development of an economy, only 28% of women own small or medium-sized businesses, and there's still an access to finance gap that's still very, very hard. We've done some work at the World Bank Group to show that if we can actually reduce these gaps, economies and countries and men and women themselves benefit, and you yourself has mentioned some of our statistics, but let me just give you one piece of data that just came out a few months ago. My colleagues at the International Finance Corporation did a study of private equity and venture firms. If you are really serious about entrepreneurship, of course you need the banks to extend credit to female and male entrepreneurs, and small and medium finance is a challenging area because it's seen as so risky. But you also need early stage finance for people who have very good ideas and can bring them to scale. And when we looked across emerging markets, this is only emerging markets now, at the venture capital and equity industry, we found that those firms that have a gender balance on their senior investment officers actually have 10 to 20% higher returns on investment than either firms that have only males or only females.
Yeah. Wow.
So this argues for the balance itself, and I think it's because of the diversity of perspectives, it's the diversity of networks, it's the diversity of experience. And many companies, almost ahead of the public sector, are actually experiencing new approaches to create diversity on their corporate boards, in their senior management, in the pipeline, and probably most importantly, in the supply chain. So just going back to that venture capital and equity example, when you have more female-owned firms in the portfolio, you also get higher returns. And there's evidence that suggests that female-owned firms tend to create employment for women. So this also has multiplier effects.
Pedro, did you want to speak to that as well? Because when you look at the data here, as Caren mentioned before, on average, women have just 3/4 of the legal rights afforded to men. We spoke about the gaps that still exist when you look at access to finance and capital as well, but what about some of those other legal barriers as well? For example, mobility is huge, not just the ability to drive a car, but the ability to get a passport and be able to travel without permissions. At the same time, property ownership rights is a major issue, and access to digital services as well. So are we able to quantify the cost of these barriers, and what are some effective ways in which we can remove them and eventually pull them away completely?
Let me complement what Her Excellency and Caren have just said by adding a little bit on the costs or potential benefits from closing this gap. So the traditional approach in which we came up with these calculations was to say, for instance, globally, labor force participation of women is 50% compared to 80% of men. And then there is also the wage gap that I alluded to. So if we were to close the gap, just arithmetically, you would be able to calculate how much bigger an economy could be. And we also have evidence from empirical studies, from historical experiences in the United States and in Europe, that over the course of the 20th century, when we've seen women becoming part of the economy, of the labor force, this had a big payoff in economic growth. Now, the big game changer, compared to these more mechanistic calculations, is what Her Excellency alluded to, and Caren as well, is that women are not just like men when they come into the economy. They bring some additional value added. They bring diversity. They bring creativity. They bring new perspectives. There's micro-evidence, as Caren said, that firms in which women are represented in senior management in boards actually yield higher returns. There's very clear evidence that on the banking system, if women are part of the management of banks and part of the supervisory authorities of banks and the financial system tends to be more stable. So if you take these elements into consideration, actually, the benefits from including women in the economy would be actually much higher than just these mechanical estimates that have been traditionally done. Now, let me just make an observation here about the challenges that you alluded to. And I'll use, to make my points, the Gender Inequality Index, which the Human Development Report Office publishes every year. It has 4 components. It measures empowerment in health, education, politics, and the economy. Now, UAE is doing very well on this index. It had a big jump, particularly because of the improvements that Her Excellency mentioned on health and education. So when on education, for instance, we measure the share of women and men that have at least secondary education. So on this aspect, actually, women are ahead. They are 13% ahead. So they are doing much better in the UAE. But if you look at the politics, at least in the last index, we haven't reflected the parity. We'll do it next year on politics. But when it comes to the economy, the gaps are still very high. So labor force participation of women in the UAE is about 50%, which is the global average, compared to over 90% for men. So this shows that this transition of women from to the economy is really the most perhaps consequential challenge that we face at present. And part of it has to do with the legal barriers that we've been discussing, and there's been a lot of progress done here in the country. But also, once again, I would emphasize this aspect of social norms. Just to give an example, the surveys on social norms that I mentioned earlier ask women if they feel that being at work hurts children. 50% globally think that if I am at work, this hurts my children. But 50% also think that being at work is the pathway towards becoming independent. So you see these contradictions, these tensions that women face beyond laws, beyond regulations, imposed on all of us by the social norms that need to be addressed.
I wanted to just add one thing. I think as we think about this issue of gender balance, I think we have to go beyond just the numbers. It's much more than just 50% women, 50% men. What I think is really important is for women really to be able to participate with men. Institutions have to change, markets have to change, laws and policies have to change. So what are the ways that they have to change? You have to make a workplace empowering for women. I'll give you just 2 examples. In my travels, there are countries that we work with, the lowest income countries, where in some ministries, for instance, the Ministry of Transport, there's not a single female bathroom in the entire ministry. If you don't have the enabling infrastructure, that's just basic. It's a very first step. But we also know that there need to be changes in workplace policies, in what is acceptable standards of behavior. We are working, for instance, with the transport sector around the world. Transport sectors need to do more than just provide the engineering requirements for a good bus rapid transit system. They need to design around issues of safety and security. They need to design in ways that bring more women into the sector as bus drivers and mechanics. They need to have the private part of the infrastructure so that women can be the drivers of the Careens and the Ubers. And they need to have systems set up that have the right type of services, whether it's childcare services or schools or other services that women and men need access to in accessible ways. So it's great to think about the 50-50, but I think that there's a much stronger important force for thinking about how we help the institutions and the systems make it possible to have the 50-50.
Your Excellency, what work is the UAE doing in this area to address these social norms? And as a standard setter in the region, what more can the country do to set the example?
There's actually much more. There's so much more to do. I still believe that we are just having small baby steps towards what the big dream for this country is. By the year 2071, which is the centennial of the United Arab Emirates, we aim to be not among, but the best country around the world. So that means so much to change, a lot to be integrated. And then again, at one point of time, we also want to share the success story of the United Arab Emirates with the world. We want other women around the world to benefit, to hear about that it's still possible. We are here in the Middle East, and it's possible. Regardless of what's happening around us, we are solid, we know where we're going, and that's basically what we're aiming for. And for that reason, the UAE is putting so much effort to ensure that not only those movement toward empowerment of women is within the UAE, but also in the region, and most importantly, globally. The UAE have provided support for women empowerment programs through multinational institutions. I just want to mention some numbers quickly. It has donated over $26 million to the UN Women since its foundation in 2010. And in November 2017, the UAE pledged $50 million to the World Bank Entrepreneurial Financial Initiative Aid. Such funds need to be supported around the world because the empowerment of women is such an important milestone towards achieving our 2030, our SDGs. One of our main goals in the SDGs is ensuring gender balance equality, is to ensure that we are there and the whole world is there. It's not only the United Arab Emirates.
Also wanted to just mention something that Caren spoke about earlier, and that is this idea that here in the MENA region, it will take 150 years to close the gender gap if we continue on this current status quo, which is unacceptable in many ways. But one thing that Caren spoke about was the role of men. So I wanted to ask you about that as well, Pedro, because this can't just be a conversation among women about creating change. What role can men play in removing and breaking down these barriers?
You're asking the men about the role of men. Let me come to that question, but first just to complement a little bit what Her Excellency said about the importance of gender equality to achieve the Sustainable Development Goals in the 2030 Agenda, because we've been focusing mostly on the economic benefits of enhancing or moving towards gender equality, but it goes way beyond that, and it goes actually beyond SDG 5, which is meant to take us towards gender equality. So just to give an example, we know that women, for instance, are critical when it comes to conflict prevention and conflict resolution, actually. This was recognized in a resolution of the United Nations Security Council in 2000. So we're celebrating 20 years of United Nations Security Council Resolution 1325, which recognized that role. And beyond the instrumental value of gender equality, whether it has to do with the economy or other aspects, and Caren mentioned this, I think that, and this takes us to Beijing 25 years ago, Beijing Conference of Women, really there's something intrinsic about the importance of moving us towards gender equality. It has to do with fairness and living lives of dignity, all of us as women beings. And if I can once again refer to a Human Development Report on this topic that we published in 1995, in which we had a sentence saying human development that is not engendered is endangered. And I think that was valid in 1995 as much as it is today. So on the role of men, I think ultimately, if you boil it down to the most important element to advance gender equality, it has to do with power, really. And we live in, whether we want it or not, in male-dominated societies. So I think that the role that we have is as role models to our daughters, empowering our colleagues to be able to move towards position of power and position of higher power, because we're making progress. We're making progress. Women, for instance, if you take politics, women vote virtually everywhere, equal rights. Women are more represented in the executive of governments. They are more represented in parliaments. But if you look at the very top, heads of state, head of government, women are still very much underrepresented. So I think that's important for men to, in a way, yield power to women.
Everywhere I go, I always speak about the role of men, because I think that we cannot achieve gender equality, which is a whole of society issue. It's everyone's issue. It's not a women's issue. Cannot happen unless men step up as champions and they change themselves, they change their institutions, and they change the way that they work. So for instance, even in the home, working in the home alongside women to parent children is really important. We know from the research literature that there's a lot that goes into childhood development from men as well as from women. From the time you surveys around the world, men have not stepped up to the extent that they could in that domain, and that's really important. And we need to create the incentive structure, frankly, and the norms change to help men to do that. It's also important, I think, that men step up to change norms. The norms that make it acceptable to perpetuate violence against women needs male leadership on this agenda. And there's a lot that men can do in terms of in their roles as community leaders, as village chiefs, as politicians, to help on the prevention side, but also on the response side. And I think that we cannot make progress unless men accelerate their stepping up.
Your Excellency, would you like to comment on this as well?
Yeah, please, if I may, Dan, thank you. Wonderful. I mean, what you have said have summed it up. A way, or probably a shortcut to achieve and accelerate the way to achieve what you've been talking about is through raising and continuously raising awareness by putting out there and showcase real-life examples that women have made it and they still can actually reach there, whether it's in the workforce, in a peacemaking area, wherever it is. It's continuously increasing the awareness of the benefits that the whole society will receive and will be able to accomplish by raising this awareness.
It's a simple proposition. We cannot increase women's labor force in the participation unless we think about who's going to care for the kids, who's going to care for the sick, who's going to care for the elderly. So we either have to have public solutions and private solutions, or we have to have men saying, we also think it's really important. So these are whole of society issues. And I think one of the things I want to point out, when men take on these roles, there's joy in these roles. It's not a burden. It is absolutely fantastic. And there's growth in capabilities and awareness and just being human.
Caren, do you think there is an angst that exists in some men today when it comes to having this conversation, though? And why is that the case?
You know, I am in a workplace that has been struggling with this for a really long time. I think men understand the benefits, and certainly I think the younger men want these changes. I see this all around the world. Men want to parent, men want to participate, but frankly, some of the structures in which they work and some of the norms actually prevent them from doing so as well. I'm going to give you one example. It comes from this region. And it's fascinating. And we have something in the bank that works on changing social norms. It's called the Embed Lab. It does behavioral science. And there was, we did a study in Saudi Arabia where we looked at norms about women working, and we asked both women and men about whether they themselves felt it was okay for women to work. The younger men said, yes, I have no problem if my wife were to work. And then we asked them, what about men who are similarly situated to you, your neighbors, your family? Do you think it's okay? What do you think they think about your wife working? And they said, oh, well, that's where the issues are. I think that I would be criticized by my family or my neighbors if my wife worked. But the thing that was so incredible is more than half of the young men didn't have that norm, but they had the mistaken belief that others held the norm. And we actually did some pilots working on that norm to say when, on informational campaigns, for instance, and some what we call edutainment, where it showed that the norm was a misperception. And actually, 4 months after we did these informational campaigns, we saw a huge increase in the pilot, at least, of women who actually went to work. And I think that's important in terms of shifting the norm.
I just wanted to ask one final question as well. When our guests leave today, Your Excellency and Pedro, what is the best piece of advice you can offer to help women be more empowered and to have a voice and to have agency when they leave this room today, Your Excellency?
Well, let's be frank. It's a discussion that will continue for years and years to come. It's never ending, and that's why we have the proper registrations. That's why we have a council. That's why we keep on raising the voice. My final note would be for women specifically: don't fight for your right. You're supposed to be granted the right. Be aware of what's there for you. Educate yourself, and your right will arrive. Women need to support women. Just as we were asking other men to support women, we need to believe. The mother needs to believe in her daughter. The sister needs to believe in her siblings in the house as well. And the story continues going on. It's the journey is still very long, but with small baby steps, I am 100% sure that we are all arriving to 2071. God knows when, where, or how old we'll be, but the world will be in a better place. 2030 is coming up. The world will be a better place by that time. We should never give up, and those baby steps need to continue.
I don't have much to add. I think that's a perfect way of ending our panel. Thank you, Your Excellency. Just maybe not a very practical, but just a plea: don't be complacent, because gender equality, as I alluded at the beginning, is a never-ending journey. Once we think that we've made achievements, new challenges come before us, so it's a never-ending challenge.
Well, thank you very much to my guests today, Caren, Pedro, and Your Excellency. Thank you again for joining us, and please enjoy the rest of the conference.